Welcome, I'm standing outside my KZ Escape E17 hatch, and in a previous video, I rewired the trailer wiring with this box here and a ground bus. And if you want to see that video, I'll put a link below in my description to my KZ Escape playlist where you can find those videos. And that is the one that talks about trailer wiring. In this video, I'm going to be doing prep to move the battery from the outside to the inside. So when I finished the previous video, I did have the cables here where I could have hooked the battery up, and I actually did some things in that video that I'm probably going to undo now, but I wanted to keep it in a working state. It's off season right now, so I haven't been using it. But when I got this had a lead acid battery, a deep cycle battery, and I'm switching to lithium. You generally don't want to put lead acid inside, but with lithium you can. Lead acid will off gas, lithium will not. Now I'm not an expert in this, I'm just sharing my experience, so if you're doing something like this, you'll want to do your own research, but maybe someone with this camper or similar camper can glean some information from my experience. So I added a ground bus here. We also have a positive bus here. This was on the camper when I bought it. And the main thing I'm going to be dealing with are these two wires here. And there's also two grounds that will go with it. So this blue one here is solar, and this yellow one is actually, it's also solar. This is the one that goes to the solar charge controller. This one goes to a solar hookup, and I'll show that in a second. So I still want to have power out here. So previously the battery hooked right into here. So now I'll have to run power out from the inside to power this, and I'm just going to keep this yellow wire to do that task. Now this blue wire I want to take inside because I'll use that with my solar charge controller. So along with that, I'll have to take one of these grounds. I'm not sure which one yet. So we'll head inside and I'll show you the prep work I've been doing there. So what I wanted to do is locate this on the inside. So what I did is I measured from the edge of the camper to here, in both directions, and I'll show you how I use those measurements inside. And this is the solar hookup here. It's just an SAE connector, and this connector was wired from here to the battery. I don't really need this, so I'm going to repurpose those wires, which is the yellow wire. Now the blue wires on the tongue come down to here, which is the solar charge controller. So this is the kitchen cabinet, so this runs from the front of the trailer to here. What I'm going to do though is take these and merge them together up here, because one set of these comes in from the solar panel, the other goes off to the battery. I'm going to send power from the solar panel to where the battery cable is, which will be at the front of the camper, and I'm going to move my solar charge controller down under the bed. Now this is an upgraded solar charge controller. It came with a Go Power model. I put this Renogy Rover Elite in. But it's kind of hard to use this cabinet with this solar charge controller in here. So that brings me to here. So this is where the bed is. So there's a panel that normally goes here. It's over here now. I've removed it. I also removed this partition here. This was held in with one screw, this partition. This had a number of screws. There was a screw on top here, and there was one kind of hidden in the carpet. This had screws in from this direction and from inside the cabinet. And then this panel lifts out and this one folds in. Normally you just fold this one in to have access to this, but I wanted to have more access. I thought about removing this whole thing, but that was going to be a lot of work, and thus far I've been able to crouch under here. So if we see here on the left, I drilled a hole there, and I drilled a hole over here. This one was already here. This was for the inverter. Now I'll be able to pull those through or something, because that doesn't need to be there anymore either. But I want to show how I located this hole. So I made the two measurements from the outside to the middle of those wires, and I marked them, and then in the middle was where I drilled the hole, and I'm actually offset probably just a tiny bit that way. Now when I drilled, I was very careful because I didn't know if the wires were going to be right in here, but they're actually cut down a little lower and off this way. So if you've used a hole saw, it has a pilot bit. I started with the pilot bit, but once I had a little groove here, I took the pilot bit out and just held it real steady and cut this out. It's hard to see here, but the wires are accessible through this hole. So there's a framing member here with a hole in it, and the wires are coming up, and they're going this way. So this hole here is the inverter wiring, and those come in probably right around here. So I measured from here to here on the outside and marked that. I also marked the center of the camper here, just because. And then I traced it up to here. So I used a borescope. Now I don't know if other people's campers will have the same wiring as mine did, but this seemed to work for me. So there's some framing like right about here. So I drilled a series of holes here, and I was hitting that framing because I was off a little bit in how I understood this. But then I drilled some lower and it was hollow. So I drilled my hole saw, and I was looking for the blue wire here, and it goes up through this framing here. So I'm real close to that. Then also we can see that the yellow and white wire here are tied into this black and red for that connector. So I'm going to disconnect all of that. So I've accessed these holes. So what next? I actually want to snip this yellow and white, and now I have power disconnected if you didn't see the battery was missing. And again, this is just sharing my experience. If you don't know how to do this safely, then seek other guidance for that. But I'm going to cut this, and I want to pull this yellow and white wire back through. And I'm going to pull that out this hole, because I'm going to mount my battery stuff over here somewhere. Now the blue and white wire, I want to leave connected here, and I want to at least pull it from outside here, and I can pull it in here, or I can pull it in up here. So I could maybe mount the solar charge controller over in this area. I could maybe put it here. I haven't decided that yet, but this is just prepped for everything. So I want to get the wires in the right places. Now my inverter wiring is disconnected inside and outside. This is kind of pricey wire, so I would like to pull this through and keep it. So I haven't decided what I'm doing with that yet. So I'm going to get this wire pulled through, and then I'll come back and give an update. Okay, so I'm back outside the camper. I was able to pull the yellow out on the inside, so I can see these are actually connected together as a pair, so I can easily see which of these ground wires belongs to the yellow. So that would be this one here. So that means this other one goes to the blue. Now I have to pull these wires through, so I have to cut the ends off. I will come back later and take that terminal off there, but for now I'm just going to cut it. I'm also going to cut the blue wire on the positive bus. I do have some zip ties here I'll have to pull the wires through. And I'll want to straighten this out to make it a little easier to pull through the hole. So I can try pushing this up through here. And this did have a big chunk of foam on it. I guess I didn't mention that. And I pulled all that off. I'll reseal this later. So I'll push that through. Should make it a little easier to grab on the inside. Now I'm going to leave a little bit out in case I need to move it back and forth before I grab it. And you can see I pulled that yellow wire out here. And I clipped the leads that are hanging down from that charger on the side of the camper. So next I'll pull the blue wire probably out this hole, and then I'm thinking I may pull the rest out of here. Now it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to actually put a cord on there when I pull it through in case I want to pull something back through that someday. Okay, so I got that pulled through there. I attached this cord. This is just some paracord. It's what I could find. Now if we go up here, as I was pulling on it, pulled out some other wire, and there was some electrical tape around it. You can see the black on the wire insulation here, so I'm just going to snip that if I can. I kind of thought maybe there was some taping all this together. That should make it easier to pull through. Okay, that pulled through super easy once I pulled that tape off of there. When I pulled the yellow wire through, there was some resistance, and I think I was pulling through that same tape. So now we have this yellow pair going from the inside to the outside at the tongue, and we have the blue and white going to the solar charge controller. Now one thing I still have to do is connect up ground from the trailer to inside. I do have the ground here, but this is 10 gauge wire, and I may not need this ground at some point because I want the ground to be as big as the combined conductors. So eventually I'm going to bring in the 8 gauge wire from the power center up here. So if I look over here, I have gas coming through the floor here for the water heater, and I can locate that on the bottom of the camper. So I may come over here and drill a hole down through the floor and bring the 8 gauge wire up through here somewhere. I'm still working through that, but I'm going to need a ground that is also 8 gauge or higher to go back to the trailer frame to ground the system. So this ground would probably handle a lot of the loads, but I want to do it properly. So I'm not sure exactly how I'll do that. I may run a whole second wire. I do have this ground here coming out. I could connect it. So this is an 8 gauge ground, and this was ground for the inverter. I could use that. This was actually the ground for the 120 volt system for the inverter. And I could even use this 4 gauge to bring ground in. This was hooked up to the battery, but I could hook this to the frame or to my ground bus. But I'm still working through that. So if you're working on a project like this, some tips, you can measure from the outside. And again, I measured from both sides and marked the measurements on here and then split the difference, and that got me lined right up. And then when I measured up here, there was a frame member. So something like a stud finder might have helped to know that was there. Another thing you could use is a tone probe. It's a great way to trace wires. If I had a tone probe, I could have traced it right to there. Okay, so I'm back here out at the tongue, and the next thing I'm going to do is clean up this wiring a little bit. This is the negative for the battery. I'll probably leave the lug here on the trailer and just remove the wire. I've got the circuit breaker for the inverter and things like that. I may leave some wires in place. I may cut some. I'm not quite sure, but I just want to clean this up a little bit because in my planning it might help. Like here I have a ground wire. It's 8 gauge. I do need one. I don't know if that's long enough. I also have this ground wire. But if I get this stuff taken off, it'll help me get an inventory of what I have and what I have to work with. So after I get this cleaned up, I'll come back and sum it up and let you know where I'm at. Okay, I have this all cleaned up. So the positive, the negative, and the ground from the inverter are here. I snipped the ends off. The ground had a butt splice in it. I cut it at the butt splice. So those can be pulled back through. I don't think I'm going to run anything through here. And they were going into this breaker. Now this had these like 8-point screws on them. I don't have any of those bits, so I just gripped it from the bottom and started unturning it. It's a split point here, so I was easily able to put some lineman pliers on that, and I backed them out to the point where I could grab the top and loosen them. So now this can be taken off. So I removed the inverter ground here that was green. I removed the ground over there that was for the negative battery terminal. I took the positive wire off of here that goes to the power converter. That's the 8 gauge. I threw it under the camper. So now in the positive here, we have the yellow coming from inside. We have the electric tongue jack and the emergency brake. So I may remove this at some point, and this little shelf, it's just held on with 2 bolts, and I may mount like a positive terminal bus down here. I have quite a bit of extra wire on the tongue jack. I eventually want to clean this up, and I'm going to leave it until I'm sure I don't want to change it. So one thing I do want to do here is I have the brake wire here that is going under the frame, and I may put a grommet in. Now in this trailer wiring box, it has 2 openings on this side and 1 on this side, but I wanted the order of the terminals in this fashion. I may actually try to pop that terminal bus off there and flip it over. That way I can have this down here, and I may put the trailer brake through here. So if I do that, I'll run a grommet through here with the trailer brake wire, and I'll run it in here and connect it up. Then on my ground bus, I may shorten some of these eventually, but that's not an urgent matter. I could also potentially shove these back in. So right now they're hanging down. I could connect them to the top and push them back up into the camper before I seal it up. But this is a lot cleaner up here. I don't know what I'm going to do with this space. I did want to get some weight off of the tongue. Now I'm taking out a lead acid battery, but I'm going to be putting in 2 lithium iron phosphate batteries, and they actually weigh the same. The lead acid was 50 pounds, the lithium batteries are 25 each. But it is moving the weight back a little bit, because I had a lot of weight on the tongue. So this is the wire I ended up with. I have 2 4-gauge cables and 2 8-gauge cables. So I'm not sure what I can use those for, but if something comes up, I'll have them. As I was pulling the inverter wires out, and these are the 12-volt inverter power wires, I did find some electrical tape there. It's also wrapped up with the RJ11 line that goes to the remote for the inverter. I will be careful to not damage that as I cut away that electrical tape. Okay, next I'm going to remove the solar charge controller. Now I'm not going to go over everything about solar charge controllers, but when you disconnect them, you want to disconnect the solar before the battery. So that's why I have my solar disconnected, because I removed the battery recently. And then if it's daytime, you can have voltage on here. So you need to be careful. You should probably go unplug your panels or cover them or something. So I'll unplug the Bluetooth up there. I'll loosen this terminal and pull this off the wall. Then I'm going to use a butt splice. Again, you want to make sure your solar's not connected up on the roof, and I will connect these 2 cables together, and I found that I can pull this one through by pulling down here. So it's pulling down the side of the wall to the ground. Now I don't want to pull too tight. I don't want to pull the whole ceiling off or anything. I don't know if something's taped, but if I can easily pull that through, then I could potentially use this down here or cut it off. Ideally, I want the shortest amount of wire going from the solar panel to the solar charge controller in the back of the camper. Now I may enlarge that hole with my hole saw. If I do that, I'm going to have to place these up there and then stick my fingers up there and pull them back down to crimp them. This had a grommet in it, but I'll probably get some sort of cap to put in there to cover the hole. Okay, so I prepped these to join them together. Now I'm going to offset the 2 wires so the butt splices are not right next to each other. I don't know if this will be able to slide through a little slit or something, but if it makes it a little less bulky, I think that would be a little better. So I have these wire feed butt splices there for 10 to 12 gauge. I'm going to crimp these on, and then I'll use my heat gun to shrink these down. So these have a glue in them, so it will seal them. Then I'm going to use this 4:1 ratio 12mm wire feed shrink tubing to further hold it together. Again, if I'm pulling it through, it'll be less likely to snag on things. But I don't feel like I'm going to be able to pull this very far. I might be able to pull like a foot or a foot and a half. So I'm going to get this crimped up, and then we'll come back. Okay, so I ended up drilling a 2.5-inch hole. Didn't have it perfectly aligned at first because I didn't have a way to do a pilot hole, but I'll be able to get a 2.5-inch cap to cover that, or I can just throw a piece of white tape over it or something. I could even maybe install a light for the cabinet there. But you can see my splice job. Now it's hard to get these the exact length when you do a splice like this, but I think I got it close enough. So now I'm going to pull this and see how much of this I can pull up into the ceiling. Okay, so I pulled that through. As I was pulling it, it got caught on the heat shrink, so I fed it up there a little bit, and then I pulled it until I hit a hard stop. So you can see I have a ton of cable that I pulled out here. Now I did hook up the panel and measured voltage on it, so I know I was getting a good connection. So I'm not completely sure what I'm going to do with this yet. I might feed it back through the wall so it comes out over here. I might attach it to the wood brace on the bed with some cable holders. So I do have a long length here. I may be able to cut some of this off because you really want your cables as short as they can be. But it is nice to have a cabinet back. It's hard to fully utilize this with a big solar charge controller there. Okay, so I decided to pull the solar wire through here. So I still have that hole here. I can put a cap in there or cover it somehow. But I figured I'm not going to want the solar controller over there. Now the inverter was mounted up on the ceiling there. I may still put that there. I should probably attach this to the wire and pull this line back through in case I want to run other wires from here to there. But worst case, I can just attach it to this piece of wood here. Okay, so I'm under the camper now. So this wire is the trailer brakes. This is the 8-gauge wire that goes to the power converter. Now this wire here was going through here and it was hanging down right here. So that's the one that was spliced. So I loosened this, I removed the power converter wire and I put a new zip tie on. So this is just the brake wire now. And I took the 8-gauge, I cut off the splice and there was some foam here. I pulled that off. And I ran this up through the hole that this gas line for the water heater goes through. So there's a grommet in here and it has little pieces of plastic to seal it. So I pressed it through and it pressed through all that. So that goes from here to here. I may zip tie this together. Now this is not super supported here, but it's as supported as it ever was. There are also no sharp edges here to cut this wire. So I'll have to seal this up later. I have a lot of sealing to do when I'm done with all of this. So for the ground, I think I'm going to drill a hole next to this for the 4-gauge cable, and I'll hook it up to the ground bus here. Now this ground bus is connected to the frame with 8-gauge wire, so I'll probably upgrade that eventually. Now 8-gauge would almost be enough, except if I hook the inverter up, I want to be able to ground that on the inside. So this could be running ground for AC and DC. Now there are multiple grounds in this too. The power converter is grounded. So this isn't the only ground anyway. But I'd rather have it oversized than undersized. And the only reason I'm using that 4-gauge cable is because it's what I have. I might as well use it. So I used this long drill bit to drill the hole. So I held it at an angle almost right up against this because it seemed like this was at that angle. So we'll have to head inside and see where this came out. It's hard to see in here, but I can feel it. It's right here. Actually pushed it up a little bit too high. Let's pull this through. And there we have it. See if I can get in there. That's probably about the best shot I can get. Okay, so we're back outside. Here's the 4-gauge ground for inside. This is the ground for the trailer lights. Now I split apart the white wire that was ground for this positive, which will go to the positive bus because that's redundant with this ground. So that's out of there. That was hanging down here. I took the terminal off for the solar that I cut off here. I still need to beef up this ground, but otherwise this is looking a lot cleaner than it was. Now, when I'm finished, I will seal this up with some tape or foam or both. Okay, so I'm cutting in here. I did make a couple changes here. I took the bus bar out of here. It was not easy to get out, and I flipped the box around. Now the bus bar is keyed. There's a little notch on one side, so I had to grind a tiny bit out. I actually just used a chisel and took a little part out behind it. If you're ever doing this, it's pretty easy to tell where it wouldn't fit. But then I snapped it back in, and then I drilled a hole here and put a grommet through for the brake line and ran it through this side with the emergency brake down here. And when I flipped this around, this isn't perfectly symmetrical. The ground wire didn't fit in here very well. I had the big 8-gauge wire, so I switched that to a 10-gauge. That's this white wire going here to the ground bus. Now I should have left that a little bit longer. I tried to create a little bit of a drip loop here. I drilled a new hole down here and aimed this down a little bit. So if water does get in, there is a hole there. I had originally put zip ties on here. I put some new zip ties on. I'd like to say this is done, but is anything ever done? So I do need to seal these wires, and then I may move the positive bus eventually. Okay, so we're back inside. Now this is where I'm going to finish up this video. I have this 8-gauge positive coming in near the gas line. I have this 4-gauge ground, way bigger than it needs to be. I've got the lines going to the solar, and this yellow will go from the positive bus or the battery to the positive bus on the tongue, and that will power the emergency brakes and the tongue jack and anything else I may put out there in the future. So my next step will be determining where I'm going to place the batteries. I'll be mounting a board or something to mount the shunt, solar charge controller, distribution blocks and everything too, and then I will connect all this up. So if you'd like to see that video, if it's done, I'll have it in my playlist. So that's all I'm going to be covering in this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you like this video, please click like. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I'd appreciate if you could do that. And thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.